Stanley Whitmore, a crotchety 82-year-old with a sharp tongue and a fondness for arguing with pigeons in the park, shocks his family by declaring his dying wish: to visit Angkor Wat. Armed with an old journal gifted by his late wife, Stanley stumbles into a wild journey he never bargained for. Beneath the temple ruins lies a sacred relic said to unlock knowledge of humanity's greatest mysteries. What starts as a grumpy old man's bucket list trip turns into an adventure of a lifetime, and a lesson on how to truly live. Stanley Whitmore, the embodiment of curmudgeonry, spent most of his days grumbling at pigeons in his neighborhood park. For 82 years he had lived by the philosophy that people were generally overrated and pigeons made better conversationalists. They didn't interrupt, after all. But this particular Tuesday morning, Stanley's routine was disrupted in a way he could never have predicted. His daughter, Abigail, stormed into his modest New York apartment, holding a poorly frosted birthday cake. "Happy birthday, Dad," she said, her voice laced with equal parts love and exasperation. She set the cake down on his cluttered coffee table, narrowly avoiding an avalanche of unopened mail. "I'm not celebrating. Birthdays are a racket invented by greeting card companies," Stanley muttered, eyeing the cake suspiciously. "What's wrong with it? It's lopsided." "Dad, it's not about the cake." Abigail sighed. "You're 82. Can't you just enjoy one birthday? You might not get another one." Stanley snorted. "Flattery will get you nowhere." Abigail rolled her eyes. "Fine, be grumpy. But humor me. What's one thing you'd want to do before you're too old to do anything?" Stanley leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. His apartment, filled with dusty books and trinkets from a life lived reluctantly, seemed to hold its breath. He reached for an old leather-bound journal on the shelf, its corners worn from years of use. It had belonged to his late wife, Margaret, the only person who had ever managed to make him smile without trying. "I want to go to Angkor Wat," he declared suddenly, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic firmness. Abigail blinked. "Angkor Wat? The temple in Cambodia?" "Yes, the temple in Cambodia. Don't act like you've never heard of it," Stanley snapped. "Your mother always wanted to go. She wrote about it in this journal, said it was the gateway to understanding. Something or other." Abigail's face softened. "Dad, you hate flying, and crowds, and humidity." "Doesn't matter," Stanley retorted. "If I'm going to kick the bucket, I might as well do it somewhere interesting." 2 weeks later, Stanley found himself boarding a plane to Cambodia, much to the astonishment of everyone who knew him. The journey was predictably unpleasant. Stanley complained about the food, the seat, and the in-flight movie selection. By the time he landed in Siem Reap, he was in a mood so foul that even the welcoming committee of smiling locals couldn't cheer him up. "Why is it so hot?" he grumbled to no one in particular as he climbed into a tuk-tuk, his suitcase precariously balanced on the back. The driver, a young man named Dara, chuckled. "Welcome to Cambodia, sir. The heat is part of the charm." Stanley shot him a glare but said nothing. The tuk-tuk weaved through bustling streets, past markets overflowing with exotic fruits and the scent of sizzling street food. Despite himself, Stanley felt a twinge of curiosity. The next morning, Stanley stood at the entrance of Angkor Wat, staring up at the massive stone towers that seemed to touch the sky. Dara had insisted on acting as his guide, despite Stanley's protests. "This is the largest religious monument in the world," Dara explained cheerfully as they walked. "It was originally built as a Hindu temple, then converted to Buddhism." Stanley grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes scanning the intricate carvings on the walls. As they ventured deeper into the temple complex, something stirred within him, a sense of awe he hadn't felt in years. They reached a secluded courtyard where a group of monks were meditating. Stanley watched them silently, the weight of the moment sinking in. He opened his wife's journal, flipping to a page where she had sketched the temple's silhouette. Beneath the drawing, she had written, "Here lies the answer to the questions we don't know how to ask." What did she mean by that? Stanley muttered more to himself than to Dara. Perhaps you'll find out, Dara replied enigmatically, his eyes twinkling. Later that afternoon, Dara led Stanley to a lesser-known section of the temple. Unlike the well-trodden paths filled with tourists, this area was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the distant chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves. The walls here bore carvings that seemed untouched by time, their details vivid and hauntingly beautiful. "This part isn't in the guidebooks," Dara said, his voice low. "Your wife must have had a keen eye if she mentioned it in her notes." Stanley pulled out the journal again, tracing his fingers over Margaret's handwriting. She had drawn symbols that matched those on the walls. Beneath the sketch, she had scribbled, "The past speaks louder here." "What does it mean?" Stanley asked, feeling an uncharacteristic pang of emotion. "Maybe it's asking you to listen," Dara suggested. As they continued exploring, Stanley couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was more than just a tribute to Margaret's wishes. The temple seemed alive, as though it were reaching out to him, urging him to remember, to reflect, and, perhaps, to forgive himself. By the time the sun began to set, casting golden hues over the ancient stones, Stanley felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. He didn't know exactly what he was hoping for, but he knew this journey was far from over. Stanley woke up the next morning with an unexpected spring in his step. Well, as much spring as an 82-year-old with stiff knees could manage. His night at the hotel had been restless, filled with dreams of temples that spoke, carvings that moved, and Margaret's laughter echoing through the ruins. The journal lay open on the bedside table, its pages rustling slightly in the breeze from the ceiling fan. Stanley glanced at it and sighed. "You always did like to drag me into things, Margaret," he muttered. Dara was already waiting for him outside the hotel, leaning casually against the tuk-tuk. "Ready for another day of adventure, sir?" the guide asked with a grin. Stanley rolled his eyes. "Adventure is a young man's game. I'm just here to honor my wife's memory." "Sometimes adventure finds you, even if you're not looking for it," Dara said cryptically, his grin widening. Stanley huffed but climbed into the tuk-tuk. The streets of Siem Reap were already alive with the hustle and bustle of morning activity. Children ran alongside bicycles, vendors shouted about their wares, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of fried noodles. For a brief moment, Stanley allowed himself to smile. The ride to Angkor Wat was uneventful, but as soon as they entered the temple complex, Stanley felt a familiar sense of awe creeping in. The massive stone structures seemed to hum with an energy that was almost palpable. "Where are we going today?" Stanley asked as Dara led him past a group of tourists. "Someplace special," Dara replied, his tone deliberately vague. They walked deeper into the complex, the crowds thinning with each step. Dara finally stopped in front of a narrow passageway partially hidden by overgrown vines. "This is where the real secrets are kept," he said, gesturing for Stanley to follow. The passage was dimly lit, the air cooler and heavy with the scent of earth and moss. Stanley hesitated. "Are you sure we're allowed to be here?" Dara chuckled. "There's no sign saying we can't." Stanley muttered something about regretting this already, but followed Dara anyway. The passage opened up into a small chamber, its walls covered in carvings that seemed even older than those outside. Stanley squinted at the symbols, their intricate details making his head spin. "This isn't in the guidebook," he said. "That's because it's not for everyone," Dara replied, his tone unusually serious. He pointed to a carving of a figure holding a glowing orb. "This is the Keeper. Legend says he protects a relic that holds the answers to life's greatest mysteries." Stanley raised an eyebrow. "And you believe that?" Dara shrugged. "Belief isn't required, but some say the relic can only be found by someone with a pure heart." Stanley snorted. "Well, that rules me out." Ignoring him, Dara moved to the center of the chamber where a pedestal stood. On it was a small, locked box. "What's in there?" Stanley asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. No one knows. The box hasn't been opened in centuries, Dara said, but there are stories. Some say it contains knowledge. Others say it's a curse. Great, just what I need, Stanley muttered, but his hands were already reaching for the journal, flipping through its pages. Margaret had sketched something similar, a pedestal with a box. Beneath it, she had written, "Only those who seek without greed will find what they're looking for." Stanley stared at the journal, then at the box. His heart pounded in his chest. "This can't be a coincidence," he whispered. Dara watched him silently, his usual grin replaced by an expression of quiet reverence. Taking a deep breath, Stanley reached for the box. His hands trembled as he touched its surface, the cool metal sending a shiver up his spine. The carvings on the walls seemed to shimmer, the air growing heavy with anticipation. Dara stepped back, giving Stanley space. The moment his fingers brushed the latch, the chamber was filled with a low, resonant hum. The carvings on the walls began to glow faintly, their light illuminating the room in an otherworldly hue. Stanley froze. "What the hell is happening?" he whispered. Dara's voice was calm. "You've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Stanley snapped, his voice rising. But before Dara could answer, the box clicked open. Inside was a small, intricately carved stone, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change as Stanley stared at them. He reached for the stone, his hand trembling. The moment he touched it, a wave of warmth spread through his body. Images flooded his mind, scenes of humanity's triumphs and failures, moments of love and loss, the interconnectedness of all living things. Stanley gasped, tears streaming down his face. "It's beautiful," he whispered. The light faded, and the chamber grew silent once more. Stanley looked at Dara, his expression a mixture of awe and confusion. "What does it mean?" he asked. Dara smiled. "That's for you to figure out." As they left the chamber, Stanley felt a strange sense of peace. The stone was safely tucked away in his pocket, its weight both comforting and daunting. For the first time in years, Stanley felt truly alive. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. His journey was just beginning. The following morning, Stanley sat at the hotel breakfast table with the carved stone in front of him. Its surface, covered in shifting symbols, seemed alive, as if it was communicating in a language beyond comprehension. Stanley poked at it with his finger, half expecting it to shout back. "Breakfast is better when it's eaten, not stared at," Dara quipped, sliding into the chair across from him. He motioned to Stanley's untouched plate of eggs and toast. "I can't eat with this thing sitting here," Stanley muttered, glaring at the stone. "What am I supposed to do with it?" "Figure it out," Dara replied with a grin. "Answers won't come from skipping your eggs." Stanley grumbled something about overconfident guides, but took a reluctant bite of his toast. The stone was heavy in his pocket when they left the hotel. Today's journey took them further away from the bustling streets of Siem Reap and into the Cambodian countryside. The tuk-tuk rumbled along dirt paths flanked by rice fields and palm trees. The air smelled earthy and fresh, a contrast to the city. "Where are we going?" Stanley finally asked, the stone weighing on his mind. "To a place that might give you more answers," Dara said cryptically. Stanley scowled, but said nothing. He had learned that Dara rarely explained himself in full. After an hour of bumpy roads, they arrived at the ruins of a smaller, less visited temple hidden in the jungle. The structure was partially reclaimed by nature, with thick tree roots winding through the stone walls like veins. Stanley hesitated at the entrance, taking in the eerie beauty of the place. "This doesn't look like it's on the tourist map," he said. "It's not," Dara confirmed, stepping inside. "Come on, old man." Stanley huffed but followed. The interior of the temple was cool and dark, the air heavy with the scent of damp stone and vegetation. As they ventured deeper, Stanley noticed that the carvings on the walls bore an uncanny resemblance to the shifting symbols on the stone. He pulled it out, holding it up to the light. The carvings on the wall seemed to respond, glowing faintly in the dimness. Dara watched with quiet fascination. "Looks like the stone is waking something up." Stanley's hands trembled as he held the artifact closer to the wall. A low hum filled the air, and the symbols on both the stone and the wall began to glow brighter. Stanley took an instinctive step back, but the glow intensified, spreading across the chamber. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the light dimmed and the hum faded. "Care to explain what just happened?" Stanley asked, his voice shaky. Dara shook his head. "I could tell you stories, but they'd only be guesses. Whatever that stone is, it's connected to this place." Stanley turned back to the carvings. They seemed ordinary again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had brushed against something ancient and incomprehensible. "Margaret's journal. She knew something about this. She left me clues." "And maybe this place has more of them," Dara suggested, gesturing further into the temple. "Shall we?" They continued exploring, the stone in Stanley's pocket seeming to grow heavier with each step. The deeper they went, the more intricate the carvings became. Stanley felt like they were telling a story, though he couldn't decipher it. The jungle pressed in around the temple, its sounds muffled as if the ruins existed in their own world. Finally, they reached the heart of the temple, a vast chamber with a domed ceiling. In the center stood another pedestal, this one empty. Stanley's heart sank. "Another pedestal? Great. Is there another box, too?" he asked, his tone heavy with sarcasm. Dara chuckled. "Looks like this one is waiting for something." Stanley pulled out the stone, holding it up uncertainly. The moment it left his pocket, the air in the chamber changed. It felt charged, as if a storm was brewing. Stanley hesitated, then placed the stone on the pedestal. The effect was immediate. The symbols on the walls sprang to life, glowing so brightly that Stanley had to shield his eyes. The hum returned, louder this time, and the chamber seemed to vibrate. Images flooded Stanley's mind again, this time more vivid and specific. He saw ancient civilizations rising and falling, their knowledge passed down through time. He saw Margaret, younger and full of life, sketching temples in her journal. He saw himself, younger and more hopeful, before life's disappointments had turned him into the grumpy old man he had become. The hum faded and the light dimmed. Stanley opened his eyes to find Dara watching him closely. "What did you see?" Dara asked. Stanley didn't answer right away. He looked down at the stone, still glowing faintly on the pedestal. "I saw everything," he said quietly. "But I still don't know what it means." "Maybe the meaning isn't something you find here," Dara said. "Maybe it's something you take with you." They left the temple in silence, the jungle reclaiming the stillness they had disrupted. Back in the tuk-tuk, Stanley clutched the stone tightly in his hand. For the first time, he felt more curious than afraid. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning to reveal its purpose. Stanley woke up the next morning feeling oddly rejuvenated, considering how much his mind had raced through the night. Images from the previous day's visions lingered, vivid and tantalizing. What did they mean? What was he supposed to do with this knowledge or whatever fragments of it he'd glimpsed? The stone, still tucked safely in his pocket, felt heavier than ever, as if it carried the weight of the questions he hadn't yet formed. Dara, as usual, was waiting for him outside the hotel. His tuk-tuk looked shinier than it had any right to be. "Good morning, sir. Ready for the next chapter of your adventure?" Dara asked with his signature grin. Stanley groaned as he climbed into the seat. "Do you ever get tired of being so cheerful?" "Nope," Dara replied, the tuk-tuk engine rumbling to life. "It keeps things interesting." Today, they were heading to a distant temple complex Dara had described as forgotten by time. The journey was long, the roads winding through dense jungle and narrow dirt tracks that seemed barely wide enough for the tuk-tuk. Stanley watched the scenery pass by, his thoughts drifting back to Margaret. She had always been the one to believe in things bigger than herself. while he had scoffed at anything that couldn't be logically explained. Yet here he was, chasing mysteries she had hinted at in her journal. When they finally arrived, Stanley could hardly believe his eyes. The temple was immense, its towering spires draped in vines and moss. Unlike the other ruins they'd visited, this one seemed untouched by tourism, its beauty wild and untamed. "How did you even find this place?" Stanley asked, his voice tinged with awe. Dara shrugged. "It's not about finding, it's about being found." Stanley rolled his eyes but followed Dara through the crumbling entrance. The air inside was cool and damp, the faint scent of earth mingling with the sharp tang of vegetation. As they walked deeper into the structure, Stanley noticed something odd. There were no carvings on the walls, no signs of the intricate art he'd grown accustomed to seeing. The temple felt bare. "This place is different," Dara said, as if reading Stanley's thoughts. "It doesn't tell its story in pictures. It tells it in silence." Stanley frowned. "Silence isn't much of a storyteller." "Maybe you're just not listening," Dara said with a wink. They reached the central chamber, a vast, open space with a skylight that bathed the room in golden light. In the center stood a massive stone table, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a single groove running along its edge. Stanley approached it cautiously, his fingers brushing the stone. It felt warm, almost alive. "What is this?" he asked. "It's a conduit," Dara said simply. "A conduit for what?" Stanley pressed. "Not what," Dara replied. "Who?" Before Stanley could ask what Dara meant, the stone in his pocket began to vibrate. He pulled it out, holding it in his palm as it glowed faintly. The groove on the table responded, lighting up with the same soft glow. Stanley hesitated, then placed the stone in the groove. The moment he did, the room seemed to come alive. A deep hum filled the air, and the golden light from the skylight intensified, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The stone table shimmered, its surface rippling like water. Stanley stepped back, his heart pounding. "What's happening?" he demanded. "Watch," Dara said, his voice calm. The rippling light coalesced into shapes, figures that seemed to emerge from the stone itself. They were humanoid but otherworldly, their features fluid and ever-changing. They surrounded the table, their translucent forms glowing with an inner light. One of the figures turned to Stanley, its eyes, or what passed for eyes, locking onto his. A voice echoed in his mind, not spoken, but felt. "Seeker, why have you come?" Stanley stammered, unsure how to respond. I don't know. I'm just trying to understand." The figure tilted its head as if considering his words. "Understanding is the first step. What you seek is not a thing, but a truth." "What truth?" Stanley asked, his voice trembling. "The truth of connection," the figure replied. "All things are one, yet all things are apart. To understand this is to understand the balance of existence." Stanley frowned. "That's a bit vague, don't you think?" The figure's expression, or whatever passed for one, shifted slightly. "Truth is not given. It is earned." Before Stanley could ask another question, the figures began to dissolve, their forms melting back into the stone. The light dimmed and the hum faded, leaving the chamber in silence once more. Stanley stared at the stone table, his mind racing. What had he just witnessed? Dara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the answers aren't what we expect, but that doesn't mean they're not worth seeking." Stanley nodded slowly, his grip tightening around the stone as he placed it back in his pocket. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was beginning to grasp its purpose. Stanley sat in the back of the tuk-tuk, staring out at the blur of green as Dara drove them deeper into the jungle. His mind churned with questions he couldn't articulate. The figures he had seen, the cryptic truth they spoke of, it all lingered in his thoughts like an unfinished puzzle. He clutched the stone in his pocket, its presence both comforting and unnerving. "You're quieter than usual," Dara commented, glancing back briefly. "You're usually complaining about something by now." Stanley gave a half-hearted shrug. "Just trying to make sense of all this. I'm not exactly used to glowing stones and cryptic alien-like visions." "They weren't aliens," Dara said, amused. "They were guides, maybe. Messengers. Who knows?" "Great, that clears it right up," Stanley muttered. Dara laughed, the sound cutting through the steady hum of the tuk-tuk engine. Their destination today was another temple, but this one, Dara explained, wasn't on any maps. "It's a place people avoid," he said cryptically, "not because it's cursed, but because it's forgotten." Stanley frowned. "Forgotten by whom?" "By everyone," Dara replied simply. The tuk-tuk jolted to a stop at the edge of a narrow path overgrown with vegetation. "We walk from here," Dara said, grabbing a machete from under his seat. Stanley groaned as he climbed out, his knees protesting the movement. "Great, a hike, just what my arthritis needs." Dara grinned. "Think of it as exercise. Keeps the heart young." The path was rough, winding through dense jungle. Dara led the way, cutting through the undergrowth with practiced ease. Stanley followed, grumbling under his breath but secretly impressed by the younger man's stamina. The air was thick and humid, the sounds of the jungle, a cacophony of birds and insects, surrounding them. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a clearing. Stanley stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The temple before them was unlike anything he had seen before. Its architecture was angular and imposing, its stone surfaces covered in strange, unrecognizable symbols that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them. "This is it," Dara said, his voice quieter than usual. Stanley approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the structure. "What makes this place so special?" "You'll see," Dara replied, motioning for Stanley to follow him inside. The interior of the temple was dark, the air cooler than outside. Stanley's footsteps echoed softly as they walked down a long corridor. The walls were covered in the same shifting symbols, their patterns mesmerizing. "These symbols, they're like the ones on the stone," Stanley murmured. Dara nodded. "They're part of the same language, a language of meaning, not words." Stanley frowned. "That's not cryptic at all." At the end of the corridor, they entered a vast chamber. In the center stood a circular platform, its edges lined with glowing orbs. Stanley hesitated, eyeing the platform warily. "What is this?" "It's a reflection," Dara said. "Of what?" "Of you." Stanley gave him a skeptical look. "I don't have time for riddles, Dara. Just tell me what it does." Dara smiled faintly. "Step onto it, and you'll see." Stanley sighed, but did as he was told, stepping onto the platform. The moment his feet touched it, the orbs around the edge flared to life, casting a soft, golden light. The symbols on the walls began to glow as well, their light pulsating rhythmically. Then the images began. They appeared in the air around him like holograms. Scenes from his life, both mundane and significant. His childhood home, his parents' faces, the day he met Margaret, their wedding, the birth of their daughter, the fights, the laughter, the quiet moments they had shared. Tears welled up in Stanley's eyes as he watched his life play out before him. But the images didn't stop there. They began to shift, showing not just his life but the lives of others, people he had known, people he had hurt, people he had helped, strangers whose paths had crossed his in ways he had never realized. He saw how his actions, both good and bad, had rippled outward, affecting others in ways he couldn't have imagined. "It's all connected," Stanley whispered, his voice trembling. "Yes," Dara said softly. "It always has been." The images faded and the light dimmed. Stanley stepped off the platform, his legs unsteady. He turned to Dara, his expression a mixture of awe and sorrow. "I've spent so much of my life pushing people away. I thought it didn't matter, but it does. It all matters. Dara placed a hand on his shoulder. It's never too late to change, Stanley. The connections are still there, waiting for you to reach out. Stanley nodded slowly, his mind racing. The journey had taken him to places he never expected, but it was the journey within that was changing him the most. As they left the temple, he felt a newfound resolve. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was no longer afraid to face it. The air was different that morning. Heavy with anticipation, Stanley couldn't quite explain. He stood on the balcony of his hotel room, staring at the sunrise as it painted the sky in hues of orange and gold. The stone rested in his hand, its surface cool and smooth. Today, he felt, was the culmination of everything. The questions, the visions, the journey. It all led here. Dara arrived on time, as always, his tuk-tuk gleaming under the morning light. "You ready for the final chapter?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Stanley hesitated before nodding. "Let's finish this." The drive was long and unusually quiet. The jungle grew denser with each mile, the trees forming an almost impenetrable wall around the narrow dirt road. Stanley clutched the stone in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of how far he had come. Dara said nothing, letting the journey unfold in silence. When they arrived, Stanley's breath caught in his throat. The temple was unlike any he had seen before, massive, its towering spires glowing faintly in the dim light. The carvings on the walls seemed to pulse with energy, as if the temple itself was alive. "This is it," Dara said, his tone reverent. Stanley nodded. "What happens now?" "You'll know," Dara replied, stepping aside to let Stanley take the lead. The interior of the temple was vast and labyrinthine. Symbols lined the walls, glowing faintly as Stanley walked past. He felt as though he was being guided, the path laid out before him with a clarity that needed no words. Finally, he reached the heart of the temple, a circular chamber with a domed ceiling. In its center stood a pedestal, its surface glowing softly. The stone in Stanley's pocket began to vibrate, its energy resonating with the room. He pulled it out and approached the pedestal, his steps slow and deliberate. "This is it," he whispered to himself. Taking a deep breath, Stanley placed the stone on the pedestal. The effect was immediate. The symbols on the walls flared to life, their light so bright it filled the entire chamber. A low hum grew louder, vibrating through the air. Then everything went silent. When Stanley opened his eyes, he was no longer in the chamber. He stood in a vast, endless expanse of light. A figure stood before him, its form shifting and indistinct, yet familiar in a way he couldn't explain. "Seeker," the figure said, its voice echoing in his mind. "You have come far." Stanley swallowed hard. I don't know why I'm here. I just needed to understand." The figure tilted its head as if studying him. "Understanding is only the beginning. What you seek is not knowledge but wisdom. The two are not the same." Stanley frowned. "Then what's the purpose of all this? The stone, the temples, the visions. What does it mean?" "It means what you choose for it to mean," the figure replied. "You have been shown the interconnectedness of all things, but the value of that knowledge lies in what you do with it." Stanley felt a lump rise in his throat. "I've spent so much of my life pushing people away, thinking it didn't matter. But now, I see that it does." The figure's light intensified. "The past cannot be changed, but the future is unwritten. What will you do with the time you have left?" Stanley's mind raced. He thought of Abigail, of the people he had hurt and neglected, of Margaret, whose journal had led him here. "I'll try to make things right," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "I don't know if it's enough, but I'll try." The figure nodded. "That is all that is asked of you. Go now, and live with purpose. The light faded, and Stanley was back in the chamber. The stone lay dormant on the pedestal, its glow extinguished. He picked it up, cradling it in his hand as he turned to leave. Dara was waiting outside, his expression unreadable. "Well?" he asked. Stanley smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think I finally understand." They rode back in silence, the weight of the journey settling over Stanley like a comforting blanket. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. Back in his hotel room, Stanley sat by the window watching the sun set over the jungle. He picked up Margaret's journal, flipping through its worn pages. Beneath a sketch of the temple she had written, "The answers are within you." Stanley closed the journal and smiled, the kind of smile that comes not from happiness but from peace. For the first time in a long time, he felt whole.